A warm welcome to the International Conference on Changing Global Economic Landscape, Sustainable Strategies for the New Normal. I, Dr. Pranami Sharma, Assistant Professor at School of Commerce, Finance and Accountancy, is the MC for the session. Today, we are on the second day of the Sustainable Strategies and Developing Landscapes. This international conference where we are looking for a global journey, and it is my immense pleasure to welcome everyone at a time, though we are at different parts and at the different world and different time zone. This is the effect of new normal, but it is just the beginning. The road is long and it requires more discussions. To build it in a concrete manner, the globe has reset the button to navigate it during the time of the pandemic. This has brought an unprecedented shift in the global economic landscape, and the world has acknowledged the importance of sustainable development. As the famous quote of Oliver states, that the lowest ebb can turn the wave, it brings a thought to the Christ University to make an attempt to discuss this novel path and to build strategies for future. Hence, today, we are having a panel discussion on sustainable strategies for the new normal. The panel members for the session today, the eminent Professor Alexander Vendipute and Mr. Neil Brown. The moderator for the session is Professor Vijay Thomas. Now I would like to take the opportunity to introduce our first panel member. Professor Vendipute is a professor of strategy and strategic foresight at IA Business School and Chief Strategy Officer at the Astana International Financial Center. Professor Vendipute is the Chairman of Corporate Governance and Stewardship of the Astana International Financial Center and the Founder Director and Chairman of the Sustainable Foresight Institute and of a Corporate Governance 4.0 at the AIFC. Sir has recently overseen the development of the AIFC corporate governance principles and its guidance. Previously, Sir was a member of the board of the National Investment Corporation of the National Bank at Kazakhstan, a managing director with the Kazakhstan Development Bank, Senior Director at the head of global practices with the World Economic Forum. Prior to that, at Shell, Professor Alexander was the Senior Strategy and the Portfolio Advisor to the Committee of Managing Directors. Prior to Shell, Professor was Director and co-leader of the Shareholder Value Practices at Prince Waterhouse Coopers. At McKinsey, Professor was a core team member of the European Corporate Finance and Strategy Practices. Professor is a decision scientist and an engineer by training and holds advanced degrees in management and decision sciences from Boston University. Was a BAEF fellow at Harvard Business School. Holds a PhD in management, strategy and finance from the University of London. A doctorate in international relations from the Geneva School of Diplomacy, and an MSc at Sustainable Leadership and a PhD in engineering, complex adaptivity system. From Cambridge University, Professor is a Chartered Governance Professional, FCG, and a Chartered Governance Institute, a Chartered Director and Fellow with the Institute of Directors and an ACD Board Leadership Fellow. This is a very small introduction that we are able to put forward. There's a lot more to add on. I extend a hearty welcome to you, sir. I would now like to invite, introduce our second panel member, Mr. Neil Brown. He has experience of over a decade in sustainability and over 25 years in risk management. From 2008, he has held various positions like COO, CEO, CRO, and chair of the investment committee at Earth Capital, part of Earth Capital Holdings, a global private equity investment group deploying capital into sustainable technology business, focused across the theme of energy, food, and water, with investment of 1.7 billion AUM US dollars. As global head of risk management for the Credit Suisse Asset Management, He has established their independent risk function. Being part of the Credit Suisse Asset Management, he has been the trustee director and also Credit Suisse UK pension scheme. Previously, he was global head of risk management at HSBC Asset Management Division. Over the previous 15 years, he has variously engaged himself in the forum of trade, broker, and management consultant. He has acted as an expert witness in fund governance and regulation cases. Sir is a chartered fellow at the CISI Institute. For the past 15 years, he has chaired the CISI diploma panel for the financial derivatives papers and chaired the CISI board forum. Sir graduated from UCL with a degree in economics. I heartily welcome you, sir. Now let me introduce the moderator for the session, Professor Vijay Thomas, Director, School of Commerce, Finance and Accountancy at Christ Deemed to be University. Sir is the founder member for the Wing Professional Studies and has associated with Christ Deemed to be University from past 22 years. And he has been instrumenting and bringing collaborations with 13 global professional bodies and has secured global awards for his performance. He pioneered the model of BCom studies to be aligned and added with global professional certifications. Sir has completed his MHRM and PGDTA from Pondicherry University. He has been to overseas for training in Tokyo, Japan, and his contributions are treasured immensely by the university. Before I begin, I would like to inform all the participants that the session will be open for the Q&A after the panelists complete their presentations and discussions. The moderator will invite you to post the questions in the chat box, and we will read it out for the panelists to respond. I'd like to now invite Vijay sir, the moderator for the session, to take over the session. Over to you, sir. Professor, are you able to hear us? Professor Alexander, are you able to hear us?
Yes, I am, but I thought you were calling upon Professor Thomas, no?
Yes, Professor.
So shall I get started?
Yes,
or
Professor.
Shall we wait for... May I share my screen?
Yes, sir. Yes. Go ahead.
Many thanks. So thank you for the kind invitation, not only to Christ University, but also to CISI. Especially George Littlejohn has been a very long friend, and we have worked together with CISI for the past 10 years or so. So today I will be talking about the potential and promise of a new normal for sustainable development and growth. And I divided my presentation into 4 areas. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about the Friedman Doctrine, because it quite dramatically influenced the way that economies around the world developed. Number 2, I want to talk about the unintentional consequences of shareholder capitalism. And then I want to talk about what really is at the core of this discussion, and that is strategic development options to contribute to sustainable, inclusive, and resilient growth. And then very shortly, I want to provide some concluding comments. So let's start with the Friedman Doctrine. That dates actually back to the 1970s. And you probably have heard about Professor Friedman, who was also a recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. And in a 1970s op-ed, he wrote the following. there is one and only one social responsibility of business, and that is to increase its profits. Depending on, of course, how profits are defined, I don't have a very big issue with that in essence. If it's defined in terms of the generation of free cash flow, and especially with a focus on the long term, this actually may not be that shocking statement. But his second statement in the same op-ed is utterly shocking in my respect, in my point of view. And he basically said that any executive who claimed that companies have responsibilities for providing employment, eliminating discrimination, avoiding pollution, and whatever else, are undermining the basis of a free society. Unfortunately, this statement influenced the formation of shareholder capitalism. And let me now move to what it led to, the unintentional consequences of shareholder capitalism. So the first one is the cost of global climate change. And if you look at global climate change, at the end of 2021, it stood at $16.5 trillion. In other words, if it would be an economy, a country, then basically the cost of global climate change would be immediately behind the United States and ahead of the Chinese economy, which is currently the second largest economy in the world. What is more interesting is that in the Stern report in 2006, it was estimated to be 500 billion. In other words, the cost of global climate change has been growing at 26% per year. In other words, it grows at about 5 to 6 times faster as the global economy in a good year. On the right hand of this slide, this comes from the Financial Times. It also shows that the frequency and the cost of climate-related disasters are not only increasing, but also accelerating. So that's number one. Number two is also the issue around inequality that was influenced by the Friedman Doctrine. And I only want to focus on two of them, the one on the left and the one on the right. So the one on the left is about mortality rate of children under the age of 5. So if you're born in Iceland, then you have a 0.2% of dying before you reach the age of 5. On the other hand, if you're born in Somalia, then there's almost a 13% chance of dying. A 13% chance of dying. 1 in 6 children will die before the reach the age of 5. And look on the right-hand side in terms of average income. There's actually a ratio of 172 times between the Central African Republic and Qatar. Now, fast forward, because this is 2017, I don't think it has fundamentally changed. The source of this is Our World in Data, which is an initiative of Oxford University. But fast forward, looking at 2020 and 2021, and especially the impact of COVID-19 on global inequality. Obviously, everybody was affected. But if you look at on the left-hand side, the bottom 20% versus the right-hand side, the top 20%, then the contrast is actually quite striking. So the poorest are expected to further lose 5% of their income in 2021, while the richest 20% are on average expected to recover nearly half of their 2020 losses in the last year. So in other words, COVID-19 is exacerbating global inequality further. Now, a third element I want to talk to is the lack of resiliency in both global value chains, but also in our economic trading system. And you probably have seen this image about the Evergreen, which is a container ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal about a year ago. It got stuck there for 6 days. And it brought global trade, 12% of global trade, to a halt for 6 days. And it took almost 2 months actually to clear the backlog. On the right-hand side, this is data from the IMF. You see the increase of $19.3 trillion of global debt, primarily driven by governments and also corporates in 2020 alone. In other words, if we would not have issued $19.3 trillion of debt, our global economy would have not collapsed by 4.9%, as the statistic shows, but 25%. How many times can we still issue that amount of debt when basically we're dealing with a global shock, an externality like COVID-19? Currently, global debt stands at 256% of global GDP. And that means that the cost of debt is going up. It also means that this debt has to be paid back as well. So how many times can we still do this? I also want to talk briefly about our global energy system, which again is not sustainable, not resilient, and not sustainable. Here I use the example of the electricity grid, but you can apply to the supply of fossil fuels as well. So traditionally, the way it works in a unidirectional grid is that you have a power plant which is centralized. Then you have transmission to the local area. Then over here, it is actually downgraded to the level that it can be used at the local level, typically 220 volts, but also it varies from country to country. And if anything happens upstream, you feel it directly downstream. Currently, we see, for example, the effects of the Russian invasion in Ukraine on the supply of natural gas, for example, in Western Europe. So if something happens in terms of the supply in Russia, we will directly see the impact on prices, but also on the availability of natural gas in Western Europe. On the other hand, we can design the system differently, which is not only more sustainable because it's powered by renewables, but it's also much more resilient. If anything happens here at the bottom, let's say in terms of a centralized power plant, it won't fundamentally affect what's happening in the grid. And this is obviously a smart grid. In my home in Belgium, for example, I'm part of a smart grid. I have photovoltaics on my roof. I have wind in my garden. And I also happen to have an EV that also at the same time serves as a battery storage for my home in case that it's needed. And on top of that, I have a smart meter. In other words, I'm largely independent from the supply of a centralized power station. So what we will see increasingly, if we want to build a sustainable, inclusive, and resilient society, is that we need to focus on decentralization. Decentralization in many areas, but especially in terms of power generation. So therefore, I think we need to move away from what is typically defined since the Paris Agreement about 7-8 years ago as ESG to the broader ISR. With ISR, I mean the focus on inclusive, sustainable, and resilient business growth for the benefit of society. All three at the same time. Resiliency is very often the one that's being forgotten as part of the broader equation. And in my latest book, the final chapter, Corporate Governance 4.0, we actually make that case that actually boards need to focus on inclusive, sustainable, and resilient business growth for the benefit of society. And we make some recommendations about how to achieve that. Let me now look at some strategic options to contribute to sustainable, inclusive, and resilient growth. First of all, I want to highlight that the fourth industrial revolution has arrived. And there are several important aspects about the 4IR, the fourth industrial revolution. Number one is that clock speed is dramatically accelerating. So that's number one. So velocity of change. Number two is that there is an increased focus on digitalization. And digital enabled trade could be the result from this, if especially well applied. More on this in a few seconds. So if you look at the country level, that includes a country like India, for example, what we need to do, in my view, is actually three different things. First of all, we need to scale the circular economy. The circular economy is one that's regenerative in nature. And this is especially the case in order to extend the competitive advantage period of oil and gas, but also of the heavy industries. This has enormous potential to at least form a bridge towards a more sustainable, inclusive, and resilient society. At the same time, we also should invest in physical, but also in digital infrastructure. And this as the backbone in order for us to build the industries of the future. Finally, we need to leapfrog into the future, and because infrastructure in and by itself is only infrastructure. So, but how do we actually realize the potentially high economic multiplier of that infrastructure is by leveraging the fourth industrial revolution and actually accelerate the economic transition. I also have here some criteria, and I want to focus on an important one, and that's actually stimulate entrepreneurship. If you look at OECD countries, about 65% of the economy is actually driven by SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. And they, in essence, are the lifeblood of the economy. In developing countries, for example, I'm currently in Kazakhstan, it is less than 30%. And very often these SMEs provide lower level services at the same time. Let me talk briefly about the circular economy. The circular economy is about several R's: repair, reuse, refurbish, and recycle. Actually, the person who invented the concept of the circular economy would even argue that recycle is not part of the circular economy. The reason why he argues that way is that basically recycling requires a lot of energy, and then the question is, where is that energy coming from? So the biggest lever is coming from those areas where basically the circle is the shortest or the smallest. So try to focus on maintain and repair before focusing on recycling, or for example, reuse or reduce. It's an important lever that is currently not exploited, not just in developing countries, but also in developed countries. There is a lot of value left on the table in the area of circular economy, although the potential is clearly there. I also want to look at how actually industries come together. And I want to use the example of the German automotive sector. Currently, 17% of total employment in Germany is actually directly or indirectly employed in the automotive sector. Now they want to call it personal mobility as opposed to automotive. And what you see in sub-ecosystem number one is that these are the traditional car manufacturers, the Volkswagen Group, Daimler, behind Mercedes or BMW. The other sub-ecosystem, this is where you have mobility tech hub, or in other words, this is comprised of startups, tech entrepreneurs, and other primarily focused, technology-focused companies. At the intersection, we have service providers. And that includes, for example, universities, vocational training providers, law firms, auditors, tax advisors, and so on. But if you look at the bottom here, what is really interesting is that this is a dynamic ecosystem that is actually continuously evolving, and most of the employment and value added is not created among the large players, but actually is created among sub-ecosystem 2 players. And hence it is strengthened the case in order to focus and stimulate entrepreneurship. I talked about the fourth industrial revolution. These are a couple of them, of the technologies that are behind them. For example, Internet of Things, blockchain and big data. Of course, with benefits also come challenges. So we also need to have a focus on cybersecurity. And then I have 3 case studies, but I'm only going to highlight one. And this is actually large-scale agriculture, where actually increasingly 4IR technologies are being used with the objective to make the industry substantially more sustainable, but also inclusive and resilient. So imagine that you have, first of all, you have high-speed connectivity, 4G or ideally even 5G. That can be either terrestrial or that can also be satellite-based. That connectivity is important in order to connect robots. These robots actually, they collect a variety of data. That data is about soil, it's about air temperature and humidity, acidification of the soil as well. And by doing so, they can actually store that data in the cloud, in a blockchain that is also dramatically more secure. And then they can deploy big data and especially AI and deep learning in order to help make smart decisions. Countries that have used that, for example, in Korea, have been able to reduce the water use by up to 80%. They have been able to reduce the use of fertilizer by up to 40%. And they have been able to increase the crop yield despite the fact that global surface temperatures have increased by, on average, 1.1 degrees Celsius by 30%. So it is possible to actually have higher crop yields in agriculture by deploying 4IR technologies, and at the same time have a much lower strain on the environment as well. At the same time, it also creates much more interesting jobs. I very often say here in Kazakhstan, we need less coal miners, we need much more data miners. Coal miners is a very unhealthy job. Data mining is a job that actually provides social mobility. It's also a job that actually, I don't know what's happening on my screen here, but there's a variety of things coming up. And therefore, it can be applied to a number of sectors. Another sector is the global renewable energy internet. I've written extensively about this already in my 2017 book. I won't go over it. Another one is, for example, the use of 4IR tech and solar power greenhouse agriculture. And the last one is actually 4IR tech-enabled logistics and transportation. What is interesting is that all of these can not only contribute to sustainable growth, but at the same time also to inclusive and resilient growth. And let me finish with the following slide. So the potential is there, not only for companies, but also for countries alike to navigate the transition towards sustainable, inclusive, and resilient growth. And the resilient growth is actually very important. And again, it's very often and usually ignored in the ESG debate. But COVID-19 has actually made it very apparent that our global value chains are not resilient. Our global energy trading system is not resilient as well. McKinsey argues in a 2020 report, I believe it's 2020, that investment in climate resilient infrastructure and the transition to a lower carbon future can drive significant near-term job creation while increasing economic and environmental resiliency. On the right-hand side, this is actually the competencies that will be acquired in the future to be able to leverage the 4IR, but also to be successful and to avoid obsolescence as a professional. And I would say that there's an important role to play for both universities, Christ University and CISI, professional training providers, to develop the cognitive, the interpersonal, and self-leadership and digital skills in order to make sure that people are able to make that transition and that nobody is actually left behind. Otherwise, we won't be able to address the I as part of the sustainable, inclusive, and resilient future society. Thank you, and back to the moderator, please.
Open now. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Alexander, for that wonderful presentation. There is some technical glitch. Am I audible now? Am I clear now? Yes.
Very clear. Yes.
As you were going through the slides, I was really getting interested because I had a very short stint in the energy sector. That is how I kickstarted my career. I was working in one of the leading energy producer in the country, which was considered one of the 9 jewels in the country. And one particular area that we were always had a big constraint was the transmission loss. As you spoke about in the first slide about the uni-grid pattern, since India is a country with almost 6 lakh villages, one of the major concern we had was the transmission loss. And at that particular point of time, it was around 30%. It is such a huge kind of a loss. Now,
that was the case at the time, if I may say, but it's not the issue anymore with the latest technologies. Yes. Now we have ultra high voltage AC and DC lines that go at 1.1 million volt and actually reduce the losses to less than 2%. So we can now transmit electricity over very long distances and therefore help enable the what I coin the global renewable energy internet a reality that is entirely powered by renewable sources of energy, and the intermittency therefore can be largely addressed. We recently did a project at IE Business School with a energy technology company, and the advisor was McKinsey, and we actually looked and modeled whether we still would need stationary storage. And the answer is, if you have a large enough area, so let's say the Eurasia region, that will obviously include India, you don't need stationary energy storage anymore. The car actually becomes, the electric vehicle actually becomes part of the renewable energy internet. And the cost right now of renewable energy sources is competitive, even before the rise in oil and gas prices, competitive against fossil fuel. They have accelerated so massively over the past 5 to 10 years that basically there is no excuse anymore but to go for renewable energy. But then connected as part of a smart grid, but at the same time also the smart grids are connected together into ultimately a global energy internet.
So, Professor Alexander, if I may come in, my second part of the question has a broader manifestation. That is, we all remember the 1992 Rio de Janeiro summit, Earth Summit. In one of that summit round, one of the leading statesman or maybe a country head was making a very, very pertinent statement. He was saying that all the developed world cut or exploited the natural resources and got developed. And now it is getting dictated to the developing world not to cut the natural resources like the forest. Now, thereafter, the concept of polluter pays also came into being. Today, my question is very specific. The broad area that you covered, probably my question is it confined mostly to the developed world vis-a-vis the developing world? Over to you, sir.
No, I think it is, first of all, we need to address a common problem. Global climate change, a lack of inclusivity and lack of resiliency is not a developed world problem versus a developing world problem. It is truly a global issue. Now, it is true, we are guilty as charged. My generation, but also the developed countries, we didn't care much about the environment. And it was largely, our economies were largely powered by fossil fuel as opposed to renewable. I would even say that we have lost about 30 years in the developed world. Now, if we go into, because these ideas have been around for a long time. Just talking about the global renewable energy internet. The concept is actually coming from Desert Tech, which is about 15 years old. And there actually, North Africa would supply Western Europe of renewable energy. North Africa has ample resources of solar, and it would then be transmitted to Western Europe. It was killed, the idea, not because of technological reasons, not because of economic reasons, because of political reasons. It was actually Sarkozy, president of France, that basically said, we don't want to be dependent on a other continent that is outside of the EU. Well, I can understand that to some degree. I disagree with his philosophy, but now if we have a true renewable energy internet, at times India will be a supplier of energy to Western Europe, and at times Western Europe will be a supplier to India for renewable energy sources. In other words, it becomes truly resilient, and everybody depends on everybody to make the system work in the same way as the traditional internet works. The only difference is that in addition to data, now we also have energy that is flowing across borders. And now talking about financing, I think that the developed countries should really come up with the lion's share of financing in order to make that happen. So that basically the developing countries are able to benefit from it as well. And therefore, I think we will be able to accelerate quite dramatically. Another thing, one thing that we do, however, expect from developing countries, that they do create a level playing field. Let me use an example here in Kazakhstan. There are a lot of subsidies that are going into the fossil fuel industry. Gradually phase out those subsidies, because when these subsidies continue to exist, it becomes very difficult to make a case for a strong internal rate of return for fossil fuel alternatives, such as renewable energy. And we're working with some of the development agencies like the EBRD, and they have an enormous difficulty in order to arriving, given the current conditions here, at a positive internal rate of return compared to fossil fuel alternatives. So we're asking basically to developing countries phase out these subsidies, because these subsidies only hinder, they don't help.
Okay, one last question before we hand over to Mr. Neil Brown. for his presentation. And we will definitely come back to have questions, because I'm very sure audience would be wanting to pose a lot of questions. Now, this particular question is in terms of the 1.5 degree Celsius challenge in global warming. Now, the pertinent point is, how quickly can we transform ourselves to clean energy? It is not an easy, as you rightly said, in terms of the huge investments that are required. In that context, when the time is actually running out in terms of meeting the challenge of reducing that 1.5 degrees Celsius, how far are you optimistic about meeting that goal in the near future?
Well, energy obviously is not the only culprit here when we talk about global climate change. It's a very significant contributor too, however. The investment, to give you an idea, to make the global renewable energy internet a reality will require about $2 to $2.5 trillion per year. If you put this in context, that we printed $19.3 trillion of money in order to avoid an economic collapse. And given that the cost of global climate change is $16.3 trillion per year and growing at about 800 billion a year, then I would basically say $2.5 billion is a drop in the bucket. So I would basically say, guys, get on with it. We currently have $200 trillion of global capital, and this money is struggling to find bankable projects. So we really need to think about less local, but really thinking about more regional and global bankable projects, and actually get on with it and actually get them implemented. As you said correctly, the time is running out. The question is, have we already reached the tipping point? I would believe that we can still do something, but the urgency is definitely there. So back to you, please.
Thank you, Professor Alexander. We will definitely be coming back with more questions and interaction. Now,
thank you.
This is the time for the presentation by Mr. Neil Brown. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today, and apologies for joining late. I had some technology issues, which, given how Alexander has been talking about the fourth industrial revolution, is a slight irony. But anyway, I was going to pick up perhaps where that left quite fortuitously. In terms of global warming, if we look at 2021, it was about the fifth warmest year on record. But the last 7 years have all been the hottest 7 on record. And the whole concept behind climate change, I think, is now certainly accepted in the scientific, becoming more accepted in the political, but still a problem child, in as much as it's, as the discussion has just gone, it's going to cost a lot of money to put that problem right. And I think what COP26 and the wrap up and reviews of COP26 has shown is that, as Alexander pointed out, we're not on track to achieve what we need to achieve for anything near a 1.5 degree outcome. And if we look at the current policies in place, we're probably heading for about a 2.5 degree outcome. If we look at the pledges in place, that probably drags it down nearer to 2 degrees as an outcome, and with all the various levels of error around that. But to put it into perspective, to actually achieve a 1.5 degree outcome in terms of global warming, by 2030, we'd need to reduce the global emissions to about, well, certainly under 30 gigatons of carbon dioxide per annum. Somewhere in the high 20s is probably about the right number. And if we look at the optimistic pledges type forecasts, we're still talking about a 50 gigaton set of emissions in 2030. So the gap between what we need to achieve by 2030 to be on track for a 1.5 degree outcome in global warming is about 20 gigatons, about 40% of the output effectively that we need to try and achieve. So yeah, my comments are more about the risks and perhaps a higher level than Alexander's, who's put forward some very specific and very detailed ideas as to how we can actually develop towards this low carbon or circular or sustainable economy. But I think where I wanted to start from is this idea of what are we currently perhaps priced in the financial markets is the best way to describe it. You know, have we priced in things like phasing out coal, no longer producing internal combustion engine vehicles, something above $100 a ton as a carbon price? Are we even heading towards zero carbon power sensibly or realistically at the moment? The sort of sea changes that we need to see in agriculture, and again, Alexander touched on that, but the sea changes we need to see in agriculture and land use, all of those sorts of things, when you look at financial markets, we have yet to realistically and accurately, even crudely price those in to asset prices at the moment. Now we're beginning to see some of the right moves occurring. You know, TCFD is beginning to get the sort of transparency that we're going to require, at least discussed and beginning to appear. But we need to go an awful lot further in terms of understanding. And this is whether you look at it at a corporate perspective, what is the corporation doing, or whether you look at it at the financial sector perspective, what are banks or insurance companies or asset managers or asset owners doing. We need far more understanding of actually footprints that corporations have today, and whether they are genuinely trying to move from those footprints over the next 10, 20 years to achieve the sorts of changes that we're going to require to get anything close to a 1.5 degree outcome. And I think the issues that I see in terms of risk at the moment are that we're not making the sort of progress in transparency. We're not making the sort of progress in genuinely embracing change that we're going to require. There are some very good initiatives out there, and things like the Transition Pathway Initiative, which is mapping out sector-based approaches to achieving an acceptable climate change outcome, are very important from an asset owner perspective in understanding the sort of questions to be asking, how to engage with corporations, what we should be pushing them towards doing, and also, you know, that the emotive words of greenwashing, you know, how many corporations are actually talking talk but doing nothing to walk or walk the talk, if you like. So it is still problematic, and I think climate is the one that's at the forefront of everyone's mind for good reason over the last few years. But we're still scarcely touching things like biodiversity, and the social issues are still way behind, other than at, you know, very local levels. The sort of global embrace of climate change and needs to be folded into what we're doing in climate change, because when we look at it, if we're talking about a sustainable future or sustainability risk or anything of that sort, it's not just climate. It is the E and the S and the G. So it is including the social, it's certainly including biodiversity. The environmental isn't just carbon output. Its impact on biodiversity, its levels of pollution other than just pure carbon emissions. But most importantly, perhaps, a sustainable future has got to be a just one. We have to be talking about, you know, sustainable energy for all, a future for all, you know, education, work, etc. So it's far wider than just talking about a carbon output. I think one of the things from a finance perspective is it's fairly apparent, even now, that some of the sectors that we look at in terms of financial markets are far more open to risk and opportunity than others. And if we look at some of the work that PRI and Vivid Economics did under a banner heading, the Inevitable Policy Response, they flagged and highlighted 4 sectors which are obvious, the ones that are at most risk, but also offer some significant opportunity. And the energy sector is obvious. Utilities tie into that pretty closely, but non-energy materials and consumer cyclicals also, those are the 4 sectors that have the greatest exposure and a very significant exposure to, and they were looking at it from a climate change perspective, but it's broader than that as well. And they were looking at sectoral change of either sort of plus 50% or minus 60%. And that really does hinge on what it is you're doing. And if you look at an energy company, are you still an oil and gas major? Or are you an Ørsted that has swung out of gas and gone into pure renewable energy? And so when we look at the risks of sustainability or climate change or biodiversity in an investment portfolio or a financial markets type perspective, we're back at stock picking. Which particular corporate or stock you choose becomes vital again, because some will be sticking their head in the sand, hoping nothing much changes for a while, looking to make hay while the sun, if you pardon the pun, is still shining. Whereas others will be going, actually, we need to look way forward. This isn't just about next quarter or next year. This is about the long term. And some corporations are embracing that, and others, bluntly, are just not. And it's the same in the non-energy materials. It kind of depends whether you're a traditional miner or you're a forestry company. And you've touched already on what do we do about not cutting down forests. Well, that's a significant issue for developing countries in particular. But we have to be planting forests, but planting forests in an intelligent manner. And single species plantations are better than not, but they're certainly not as good as a robust and a deep multi-species traditional style or natural forest. So there's a lot to go on, not just in the knee-jerk reactions. But I was asked to think about risks, if you like, and I think I just wanted to walk through some of the risks that are very obvious in terms of partially climate, but the wider sustainability issues. And I think they fall into sort of broadly 3 groupings. And if we think about physical and transition as a couple of headings that we all play with, I'd throw in a third one of a bit of both. So in the physical risks, we've got to be considering asset damage or destruction, and that includes things like sea levels and the amount of the world's population that lives at sea level on coastal plains, the amount of urban build, industrial build, economic build that is going to be threatened by rising sea levels over the rest of this century. But it's also about storms and floods, inland floods. And in the UK, we have particularly managed to build over an awful lot of our floodplains and concrete over an awful lot of the overspill and overflow and exacerbate floods. We are getting more and more storms in the UK than we ever had, certainly in my lifetime. But the impact of those has been increased dramatically by the actions of local authorities and developers in concreting over an awful lot of the areas that traditionally would either act as the overspill or overflow or would soak away the water that was pouring in there. So asset damage and destruction is something that's going to happen for a number of different reasons. We're also going to see population displacement, and we've been seeing some of that over a period of time. But the likelihood is that that's just going to be exacerbated over the next couple of decades, particularly because we're also likely to see agricultural displacement. We are going to see a northerning, if such a word exists, a drift north of some of the agricultural regions, certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, for obvious reason, and a diminishing ability for those tropical regions to support themselves from agriculture unless there is a dramatic change in how we grow food. Do we actually try, or do we have any alternative but to try to develop indoor agriculture for areas where external and outdoor agriculture no longer works? As an aside, as a business that I've been involved in, we've been actually doing that in sub-Saharan Africa and Botswana. We inherited a farm that grew outdoors. We moved it systematically into polytunnels as a test bed to see how it would work, and we're moving that now into cooled greenhouse, a hectare size internal growing environments to greatly reduce the impact of weather. It is weather as well as climate on the crop that we're growing, reduce the amount of fertilizer we need to use, reduce the amount of water we need to use, et cetera, et cetera. So there are solutions to these, but it is quite a likelihood that there's going to be significant population and agriculture displacement northwards in the Northern Hemisphere. And that ties into this whole physical sets of impacts tie into the idea of insurance. The cost of insurance is not going to decrease. It's only going to get more expensive. And there will come a point where the availability of insurance becomes the question we're actually addressing. The CEO of AXA, who sat there and said a 4-degree increase world is totally uninsurable. If 4 degrees is totally uninsurable, a couple of degrees is markedly less insurable than it currently is, and will be uninsurable in some markets. So this idea that we can always gain insurance and rebuild after events is something that I think is going to get significantly challenged. If we move on to the sort of transition risks rather than the physical ones, so the business environment, much has been said about stranded assets, and that's a fairly obvious one, those that we cannot use for good reason. Technological change, you just listened to Alexander give one of his wonderful speeches on technology and the way the world is going to change and embrace and benefit from technological change. But that's also going to mean that historical companies, processes, products, and systems are going to get left behind. I like the thought of the ice machine. To you and me, the ice machine is something that works off refrigeration and produces little cubes for us to drop into our cocktails. Go back a century and the ice machine looked like a combine harvester. It cut slabs of ice in the Hudson Bay, which were put into ships, floated down canals, and put into ice stores on the Hudson River, so that Manhattan occupants could drop blocks of ice in the summer into their cocktails. Technological change means that what we have always done may not survive to what we're going to be doing in the future. And Alexander is far better placed and far more lucid on that than I am. Consumer preferences. We are beginning to see, perhaps more so in the Western world or the developed world, consumers beginning to, not necessarily vote with their feet, but at least shuffle their feet. They are beginning to look for more sustainable products. They begin to care a little bit more about what it says on the label. Now, labeling is an interesting thing. We're back at transparency and greenwashing and all the rest of it, but we are beginning to see consumers look for a more sustainable product, a lower carbon intensity product, etc. But that ties in that consumer shift to reputational issues. Reputational risks for corporations are going to grow dramatically. The climate disasters or the financing of deemed dirty activities, poor social practice, poor governance, all of those issues are going to haunt a far more globally connected world. Go back 20 years to when I worked at Credit Suisse 20 years ago, and we had the Three Gorges Dam adventure. It's interesting how the head office in Zurich was surprised by a bunch of protesters outside who broke in and complained about bank finance for that dam. Think how different that would be nowadays with the internet. and the connectivity and social media and all the rest of it. So the world has changed, and reputational risk is going to spread. This idea that you could have a reputational issue which was local or even national is one that I think has almost had its day. Almost any reputational issue can become global because everyone has a phone, or not everyone, a vast majority of the world's population has a phone with a camera and an internet connection. So it flows far more quickly around the world than it ever used to. A lot of what we're changing is supposed to be driven by policy, law, regulation, and that is true. Corporations are being driven by that. It's interesting in the financial sector, we do have a lot of people who are saying that sustainable investing, sustainable finance will be driven by regulation. Regulators play catch up in almost everything else. So to assume that the regulator will lead on this is a little bit either naive, optimistic, or perhaps even Machiavellian. The regulator will play their part and has a big part to play in regulation. The law has to be right, policy. It will take time to get it right, otherwise the unintended consequences will be even greater than usual. But it will be a slow-moving beast because unfortunately regulation always is. Commodity prices are changing, and we're seeing that in the oil and gas sector at the moment for obvious reason. But commodity prices will continue to change. You know, rare earths and the various metals, etc., that go into batteries for electric vehicles. You know, if we suddenly are going to have 1 billion electric cars on the road, we currently have somewhere around 1 billion internal combustion engine vehicles on the road around the world. The demand for the raw materials to construct batteries is going to grow exponentially. And that whole rare earth, rare metals and battery components already at current production levels has its, let's say, challenges on the social side and the governance side, etc., as much as anything else, and the finite resources that we have there. So there are going to be issues around commodity prices which we just haven't dreamt of yet. And last but not least, in this particular area, the increased reporting and transparency that everyone is going to have to respond to, and that's from pension funds to corporations to asset managers to banks. Everyone is going to have to produce more reporting. If I look back at a bank set of reporting accounts from 1999, its risk reporting in its financial statements would be a paragraph on one page buried towards the back of the book. If you look at one now, it takes up about 40% of the financial report. When Scandi Bank first produced, was it Scandi and Skills, or one of the Scandi banks first produced their risk reporting in their financial statements in about 2000. The rest of us looked at it and went, what on earth are they doing? How can they put that into their financial statements? We're going to have to do this about E, S, and G going forward. So there's going to be a significant change in the transparency and reporting requirements. Some will be mandated, some will just be, will have to happen. But that in itself is a significant change and risk to most businesses. And I think, where does the both come in? Well, it's around the business disruption, and that might be physical or transition related. It's about reconstructions. We are going to have to reconstruct things after damage. We're going to have to reconstruct business processes. Yeah, Alexander's already touched on the global nature and connectivity of supply chains. One of the things that Russia, Ukraine is questioning at the moment, if you like, is exactly how global our supply chains and our economies are going to remain going forward, and how much of a retrenchment back into national or regional, but some lower level than global areas of activity we're going to see. And I think this whole idea of replacement, this idea that, you know, you buy a mobile phone or you buy a tablet, it's sealed for life, you can't change the battery, it's actually glued shut so you can't get into it and do anything. All of those sorts of ideas of replacement, you know, The right to repair is something that's beginning to get kicked around again. We are going to have to go back to a circular economy that says, yeah, things are reused, and they're reused in a number of different ways. One of which is they're taken apart, repaired, or parts are used for something else. So we're seeing sea change. And what does this mean for corporations or for management or for businesses? I think it falls into two parts, this kind of risk area. There's the now bit. What's the drivers of our business now? What do we have to do now? What are our exposures or risks to things related to climate or social or governance? And what do we need to do to survive or hopefully succeed over the next few years, whether that's 2 to 3 or 3 to 5 as is kind of a typical corporate time horizon. And the second thing is that piece that maybe I started at, where do we need to be? If we need to be somewhere in 20 years' time, what do we need to be doing now? And some of the businesses are really going to have to question whether their product or services are a kind of what I might call a post-2050 environment. Are they part of a net zero, circular, low carbon, whatever you care to call it, economy, or are they not? And if they are, that's fine and dandy, and they're probably on a transition pathway and they're feeling happy and smug and still paying themselves bonuses. But if they're not, they have a real question to address, which is how do they get themselves to be relevant over the next decade or two so they do become part of that 2050 solution, becoming part of the solution, not part of the problem. And for a lot of companies, they're somewhere in the middle. You know, that some of their products probably are kind of okay, some of their products are kind of not okay. There are a few sectors that is fairly obvious that they're not part of the post-2050 environment. Now, whether it's 2050 or 2040 or 2060, moot point, but they're not part of the post-fossil fuel, let me put it that way, environment. And therefore, they have decisions to take as to what their transition is genuinely going to be. Now, I've rambled on for quite some time, so I'll probably stop at that point and take some questions.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation, and quite a lot of areas for deliberations have opened up from your talk. Probably let me take some smaller areas to begin with, and then we can expand probably 1 or 2 questions, and then we can share between 2 panelists. One interesting point which you made at the micro level is about planting of trees. And you said it is not monoculture. You said, how do you plant the plants of diverse kind of origin and nature? I just want to give a very interesting example from the local village that I was going around in my native. The biggest concern now is, since India is really thickly populated, one of the major concern is about man-animal conflict. So the point raised by one of the local residents, and not from the scientific community, from a local villager, was that most of the animals are coming out of the forest because the temperature inside the forest has considerably increased. Now, this is primarily due to monoculture. And in those days, it is in this particular area, it is deciduous trees, like teak is mostly cultivated. Some area, it is acacia. So it is actually the kind of local interventions which is contributing to, and we need to also be aware of what is the compounding effect of these micro level practices to the regional and probably to a global level, how it gets manifested. One more example, I want to pick it from a local area, is that earlier these rivers were flush with biotic organisms. I mean, a lot of aquatic animals and life forms were available. Now, probably, as you mentioned in one of the areas about the increasing level of pollution, most of this have got wiped off. Now the rivers are actually clean and devoid of aquatic forms. So again, the question to you is, to what extent is the compounding effect at a micro level is going to have an impact at a regional level and also at a national and global level? That is one part of the question. Second is, again, what are the economic ramifications? Like most of the people who are into subsistence living, these kind of practices, you can't suddenly wipe it off. So at a micro level, what are the kind of interventions that we can look at so that it has to start from the local and then gradually move up to the national, global level? Over to you.
I think the short answer is yes. The problem you have is that a widely biodiverse natural environment typically is one that will support subsistence activities, subsistence, whether you call it farming or hunting, gathering. It supports a subsistence lifestyle. What it doesn't support is an industrial lifestyle in any shape or form. And in order to raise economic and living standards, moving away from subsistence tends to drive you away from that natural environment with the diversity of all forms of biodiversity, if you like, towards a more structured agricultural approach to land usage. And both Alexander and I have touched on this idea of what are we going to use land for and how we're going to use it. If you look at Latin America and you go, there are great swathes of Latin America where forest was cut down, cattle were grazed, and the land is now degraded beyond all belief, then repopulating that with monoculture forestry is an improvement. It's not as big an improvement as putting back some form of tropical rainforest, if you like, but some form of biodiverse environment. It's not nearly as good as that, but it's an awful lot better than leaving it as barren land and watching the topsoil blow away. And I think in terms of the interaction between man and animals, that's always going to be a problem at the edge of genuine wild country versus plantation or agricultural country, because the genuine wild country is getting diminished. We want to stop cutting down forest, but you've touched already on the economic impacts of that for developing nations. But in terms of the lungs of the world and the biodiversity of the world, there's no doubt we have to stop cutting down natural forest, and we have to replace natural forest with natural forest. I enjoyed a couple of trips over the last decade or so down to Rio de Janeiro, and it's a city that's split by a 3,000-foot high ridge that runs up and down the middle of it, give or take. And it's now natural rainforest again. If you go back 150 years, just over, it was coffee plantation. The forest had been cleared completely and it had been terraced to produce coffee for the local inhabitants and for export. And about 100 and a bit years ago, that started to get reversed by a very forward-looking, I'll call him a mayor of Rio, he probably wasn't, but that ridge is now, it looks like it was natural rainforest its entire existence. So it can be done, and it can even be done local to a city or in the middle of a city, which it is in the middle of Rio. But it takes quite a lot of political will and quite a lot of money effectively to do that. So we're back at that age-old, if money was no object, we wouldn't have the problems we currently have. But that balance between the local, if people are not going to be given jobs for a new monoculture, well, monoculture top forestry doesn't employ many people, but if people are not going to be put into industrial urbanized jobs, then they have to be supported in some shape or form, and they need useful employment, worthwhile employment, to feel like worthwhile members of society. So we are going to have to reskill and rethink the barbell between Alexander's fourth industrial revolution and robots and people at the other end, what are we going to do with them? Well, it would be nice to say we're going to give them a wonderful lifestyle and they can just live a life of luxury and leisure. It's probably not going to happen yet.
So I'm getting quite a few questions from all over. So I will read out one of the questions. Sustainability should not be addressed only at the policy level. It has to be in the DNA of every individual. How can we approach this from an education aspect?
I'll let the professor go first.
Well, it's a very interesting question, and I also believe that the family has an important role to play. But let me, in terms of values and education while children are growing up, but let me try to address it at university level education. Since the start of the pandemic, well, I just came back from Madrid last week, so I'm back largely in a hybrid mode now. Before I was teaching primarily full-time, face-to-face, but at the beginning I was actually teaching entirely online. And I was actually asked also to teach for the first time in the BBA program. Before I was only teaching in the MBA, the full-time MBA, and also the executive MBA. So talking about different generations, now I'm teaching also with Gen Z. And I can already tell you that I see a significant difference in the way they look at the world. That's one. So first of all, I would say it is, who is your audience? And I think that's already very important. Who is your audience that actually you're engaging in a powerful learning experience? Well, hopefully. Number two is that at least at IE Business School and at IE University, sustainability is embedded in all our courses, every single one. Last week, for example, I was teaching in Tech Labs. Tech Labs is part of the lab period, which comes after the core period and before the elective period. And we have four different labs, and the Tech Labs actually looks at how tech can be applied to solve a sustainability challenge. And so sustainability is always at the core of any course, whether that's accounting, whether that's strategy, or whether that's marketing. And when did we see that happening? We started actually happening in the past 5 to 6 years, post the Sustainable Development Goals, but also post the Paris Agreement. I don't think that IE is alone in that. I'm a graduate of the MST in Sustainability Leadership. That's actually, interestingly, my latest degree at Cambridge University, the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and they have been providing sustainability education, not necessarily at degree level, for the past 30 years, almost 30 years. So we see that increasingly being reflected in curricula, not only at business schools, but at universities as well. And that's a very positive development. Is it universal? I would say probably not. The other thing is, it's not just about education. It's also actually how educational institutions lead by example. So we at IE, we build a new tower for the undergraduates. And it's one of the most sustainable buildings in the world. For example, the water that we turn back to nature is cleaner than the water we actually took in. So that's another aspect as well, which is of course much more difficult to do with well-established universities like Cambridge University. How do you actually turn that city into a sustainable city, sustainable university is much more difficult. I would also say there's a very important role to play for professional bodies. CISI is one example of that. Now I only focus on professional qualifications. I'm currently involved in cybersecurity board oversight, for example. But last year, I was part of a continuous learning cohort, and there was actually ESG on the board. So, and that was with the National Association of Corporate Directors in the United States. So I think there's also a very important role to play of the professional bodies and how basically those principles and philosophy is actually embedded in professional qualifications. I would argue that it's very important to continue to develop. And interestingly, recently in Singapore, one of the senior members of parliament has argued that a degree should have a time stamp. Unless people continue to develop, and especially around areas that are of relevance today. And sustainability is obviously one of those areas that is critical, not just as a business professional, but also, let's say, as a regulator. And Neil has touched upon the regulator, that the regulator is typically behind the curve. So how can we make them ahead of the curve, so to speak? And education, again, I think is very important at that.
Over to Mr. Neil.
I think Alexander's obviously covered the sort of the slightly older and professional. I think it's important that we embrace sustainability all the way through education in different ways. You know, at a primary school level, you're not going to address it in the same way as you are at a university. But I think the whole idea of not wasting resources and reusing things and recycling things should be embedded in the educational program for our youngsters and our children all the way through their school career. I think as they go through their school career, they should be getting more exposure to what is a sustainable future and what is not a sustainable future, and how personal choices as well as corporate or governmental choices have an important part to play on mitigating the impacts of climate change and the loss of biodiversity, etc. So I think it is important that we educate all the way through an individual's life, from as soon as they can start to take on board knowledge until the day we die. We're going to carry on learning. I'm greatly impressed by Alexander's willingness to keep taking exams. He's certainly way beyond me on that one. But I think it is important that we do continue to follow our chosen path with ongoing training and updating. And I think sustainability is always going to be a part of that, whatever our path is. So in terms of education, it's got to be lifelong.
On one hand, we find the global strategists thinking long-term, short-term, looking at various perspectives. But on the other, we find that the long-term strategies may not play out the way that it should be, especially in the context of overarching developments, like, say, for example, the war in Ukraine, or the pandemic, the climate change concerns, the technology disruptions. So all these have a profound impact on having a long-term sustainable planning. In that context, how do you balance between the kind of requirements of the organization or the country on one hand, and on certain sudden contingent developments like what I mentioned about the war, the pandemic, and so on? How do you, what is the interplay? How do we play out effectively, efficiently, and on a sustainable manner? Question is open to both.
I think I'd split that into three bits rather than two. I think there is a long-term strategy which has that, whether you call it generational or decade-long or decades-long approach, which has got to be all about, at the moment, how do we make ourselves relevant for post 2050? There's then a sort of a medium-term thing, this 3 to 5 year kind of view that says, what do we need to achieve over the next few years? that mean we're on that transition pathway that gets us, to that 2050 or 2060 or 2040 or whatever it is point. I think in terms of some of the things you've mentioned, these are far more immediate. And you have to be far more reactive to those sorts of events and build them into whatever your 3 to 5 year view is, if you like. So, whether you call it a pandemic or whether you call it a war or anything else for that matter, it's how do we react to those events when they occur, and how do we actually assess them as to whether they are a few days, a few weeks, a few months, or a couple of years. When the pandemic first came out, there was a great indifference to it, and it will all be over quickly. We're 2 years on, and we're coming out the far side to a greater or lesser extent, but it's still going to be with us, forever at one level. But even over the next year or 18 months, it's going to be with us probably quite seriously, and with some big upticks and some big problems, and maybe a bit more than that. So from a corporate perspective, planning into that, it's kind of how quickly did the corporation realize that it wasn't a first half of 2020 problem, but actually it's a longer term problem than that, and how quickly do they go? So how do we react to that? How do we, as a supermarket, how do we start delivering to people's homes? As a training organization, how do we get onto Zoom? As any organization, how do we embrace Teams, Zoom, and everything else? And there was a great slide that I used over the last couple of years, which showed Zoom suddenly becoming the same market capitalization as the 7 largest airlines in the world. We stopped traveling and we all started Zooming. So it's how do we respond to those kind of events rather than how do we try and plan for them? You can't plan for them. You've got to react to them. But it's that kind of 3-stage thing. It's what are we doing right now, reacting to whatever's going on around us? How are we planning the next few years as part of the first step in our long-term strategic plan, which is the decades-long view?
For paucity of time, can we have a quick response from Professor Alexander?
Well, I fully concur with what Neil mentioned. You may have heard of a concept which is called the 3 horizons, and that's and it's fully compatible what Neil has just mentioned. I just wanted to add one more thing. When I was transitioning from Shell International to the World Economic Forum, that was in 2004, I wrote a paper, and that paper was called The Animal Kingdom of Disruptive Risks and the Future of Competition. There I identified 3 animals. First of all, it's black swans. That was initially coined by Herman Kahn in 1950s. I'm not going to talk about those further, but there are 2 others that are very interesting. The gray rhinos and the white elephants. And they're very important for strategy. If you look at gray rhinos, this is where actually you already have weak signals. So, for example, when the IPCC was created in, late 80s, I think, 1988 or 1986, then basically there were already very clear signals that global climate change was anthropogenic, and that actually it could potentially develop in something which would be very disruptive for business and society as well. You would develop scenarios for that, and that would be, you would be looking at medium-term strategies in order to internalize these externalities. The last animal that I spoke about was the white elephant. And the reason why I coined it the white elephant, because an elephant is very big, and given that it's white, it's actually very visible as well. In other words, the writing is on the wall already. If you look today at global climate change, the writing is on the wall. And that basically means that you have to act now. If you don't act now, you will go the way of the dinosaur. And as Mike Carney said, a lot of companies will actually face bankruptcy because they haven't acted. So when you think about your 3 horizon strategy, I think it's very important to explore externalities and actually think about what that actually means for your strategy. The white elephant, if you don't act, this is in order, as I mentioned, it will lead to bankruptcy. The gray rhino is actually in order to make sure that you don't become disrupted, so that you disrupt yourself in order to avoid being disrupted yourself. A very quick statistics. At the end of 2020, the market capitalization of renewable energy companies in Spain, in Italy, in the United Kingdom, and the US exceeded the market capitalization of oil and gas companies. What is that telling us? What is the market telling us about the future of energy? And this is actually something that can easily be explored by scenario planning, and also about other instruments that we have to explore the future.
Can I just add one thing? Can I just add one thing, picking up on what Alexander said? I agree with him wholeheartedly. Donald Rumsford came in for a lot of abuse on his known knowns and his known unknowns. The fourth one of those, which wasn't his at the time, but is put into the same category, is the unknown knowns. Those things we actually know, but either deny or forget or ignore. And I think that's really at the heart of what Alexander was just talking about. We know what we need to do, we know the problems we're addressing. The real question is, are we going to address them now?
So we have reached the end of our time slot. Thank you, Professor Alexander and Mr. Neil Brown, for the wonderful session that we've had. Quite a lot of areas of concerns you have very clearly delineated in your discussion, and I have got quite a few questions. Unfortunately, we will not be able to take it up now. Definitely, we will be sharing it with you all. On a closing note, the international conference held by or holding by the School of Commerce, Finance and Accountancy, Christ University, has had evoked a lot of interest and participation. And this is one particular area where the world has to be completely focusing on. Otherwise, our existence would be questioned. Now, as a university, we have been looking at what are the new areas that we have to look at post-pandemic period. Maybe the war, the kind of crisis in Ukraine is going to create a different kind of challenges after this. So how are we going to, in fact, from educational institutions perspective, the things which we have worked very well over these years may not work effectively. So how are we going to disrupt our kind of learning system altogether to make a meaning to the world at large? So with this few words, I really want to thank the organizers of the event, and in fact, Dr. Pranami, for organizing this event very, very effectively. Do you have any closing words?
I can conclude.
Yeah, for conclusion, I would hand over to Dr. Pranami. Thank you for the brilliant opportunity, and thank you for being part of the deliberations. Over to Dr. Pranami.
Thank you, sir. I would really place my sincere thanks to Professor Alexander and Mr. Neil for giving us the opportunity to have a discussion and taking it forward to this level. Having a global discussion like this would definitely boost everyone, and there is a space for more of brainstorming. I truly believe all the participants have gained a greater amount of knowledge and thought food for them to take it forward. I would also thank all the participants because of the constraint of time, as already said by us, sir, that we are unable to take all the questions, but we will definitely be connecting in future time. At the end, I would like to thank the university, the department, and all the other people who made this a success, including the technical team and all other members to it. Thank you so much. I remain.
Many thanks. Bye-bye. Take care.
We will conclude this session and we will be joining for the next session shortly. That will begin as stated in the agenda. Thank you.